Okay, so let's continue our discussion. Our panel is dedicated to the question of illiberal regimes, dismantling the rule of law. Issue number 2, the human rights protection. So I'd like to thank Marie-Laure for a very kind invitation to be part of this conversation. And I'm also very grateful to our guests. Maybe just before leaving you the floor, maybe I would like to emphasize 3 points that are at this stage of the conversation, I think are really remarkable, and I have in mind these 3 points since yesterday. I think that since yesterday we experienced and witnessed the centrality of the Hungarian experience, which has served as a lab, I would say, for illiberalism. And I think this is a remarkable point that we could here notice. This is the first point. Second, maybe more important, the great problem we have, the great difficulty in identifying the threshold of illiberalism, which is very difficult to identify, to even define. And it's also, it might be also the strength of illiberalists not to be called, if I can say, not to be identified as such. And I guess it's part of the strategy that they use when they do exercise the power. And maybe a third remark, which is more personal. We did not, until now, evaluate that much the state's conduct at the international level and the respect and consideration given to international law, which might also be an indication for us to qualify a regime as illiberal. And for example, to be back to this Hungarian situation, the decision that was made by Orbán to withdraw from the Rome Statute pretty recently and leave the International Criminal Court. So I just had these few things in mind. I will now have the pleasure to hear from the 3 speakers. So we have first Marie Padilla. Marie, you are assistant professor, maîtresse de conférence in public law at Université of Bordeaux. And you will tackle the issue of the academic freedom under illiberal pressure in Europe. And we might draw here a parallel between your question and a very recent decision made by President Erdogan to close the Bilgi University in Istanbul, which is a private university, but was and still is considered highly critical of the government. And we're talking this morning about the so-called Soros University in Budapest. We're also impatient to hear from Professor Juliet Stumpf from the Lewis and Clark Law School in Portland, Oregon, with a very promising intervention putting fuel to the fire, human rights violations and the aggregation of autocratic power. And you told the panel before our meeting that your ambition is to make this inquiry and discuss the question whether violating human rights can accelerate the accumulation of autocratic power. And last but not least, we will benefit from the intervention of Professor Jean-Yves Pranchère, who is Professor of Philosophy at Université Libre de Bruxelles, on the topic, the liberal continuum, discourses delegitimizing human rights, which is a phenomenon that we unfortunately witness quite often also in France. So I leave you the floor. Marie, you could start. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My first and opening words are for the organizer of this wonderful conference, just to warmly thank them for having me today and take part in this very important and very challenging debate about liberalism. I have to admit that I slightly amend the title of my contribution, and I would like to invite you to a more common vision and approach to the question of attack against academic freedom and in connection with illiberalism. So the new title of my presentation is "It Can't Happen Here, Academic Freedom and Illiberalism in Old Democracies." In 1935, Sinclair Lewis, the first American Nobel Prize for Literature, published his dystopic novel, It Can't Happen Here. Set in 1936, the novel presents the rise of Buzz Wendrip, a populist leader, and the establishment of an autocratic government in the US. Back then, facing the rise of fascism in Europe, the novel sounded like a warning message to American citizens. No matter how old your democracy is, here too fascism can happen. Yet, and until recently, consolidated democracies seem to suffer of the "it can't happen here" syndrome when it came to academic freedom. Eroding, harming academic freedom, and even capturing academia were understood as distant threats, something for the global south or for Eastern European countries. The first weeks of Trump's second term proved us wrong. According to the 2026 issue of the Academic Freedom Index, over the last decade, academic freedom has declined in 50 countries. In 2025, a similar observation was made by the Scholar at Risk report, highlighting attacks on academic freedom as being frequent and pervasive in the context of authoritarian or illiberal regimes. Since the creation of this last index, in 2011, registered attacks on academic freedom have usually taken place in the context of autocratic systems, war, civil war, or religious repression. In 2011, the main cases were Ethiopia, Nigeria, Mexico, Afghanistan, or Pakistan. Killings, disappearances, imprisonment were the main kind of attacks observed against members of the academy. The nature of the attacks was directly threatening the person, family, and life of scholars and students. Back then, Europe and America, and more generally, all consolidated democracies were not referred, except for some isolated incidents, as a loss of position. At the time, the idea of a siege against the liberal values of modern university appears to be foreign to Western democracies. It does not mean that universities as knowledge institutions were not challenged, especially in the context of neoliberalism and knowledge economy, but their epistemic foundation did not appear to be questioned. In the 2010s, the picture started to change in the context of democratic backsliding and the rise of illiberal regimes in Europe. The Hungarian and the Polish cases are well known and offer the main example of such a development. In March 2017, the Orban's government amended the Higher Education Act, targeting the functioning and autonomy of the Central European University. This move led to the CEU leaving Hungary and relocating in Austria. Hungary was condemned by the ECD in 2020. In the same way, teaching of gender studies was targeted by the Hungarian government. In Poland, law professor Wojciech Sarjowski's opposition to the then governing party's peers exposed him to judicial harassment and administrative sanctions. This case differed from earlier attacks on academic freedom. The use of the law, of legal tools by governing party to weaken academic freedom offer a matrix for illiberal attacks on universities and critical thinking. Justified by a defense of national identity and values against foreign interferences, these legal attacks are a part of legalists' autocrats' playbook. More than just a consequence of democratic backsliding, through this example, the capture of academy appears to be part of democratic deconsolidation itself, and it was replicated in other systems such as Bolsonaro's Brazil or Miguel Argentina. But, and along this development, the same reports also insisted on a new dynamic. Since 2018, a growing number of incidents weakening academic freedom have taken place in countries with strong democratic institutions. In this way, the first two Western cases to be integrated in the different reports were the UK and the US. However, and despite the resignation of Boris Johnson's government, it did not mean the end of endangering academic freedom in the UK. In August 2025, the current British government confirmed the implementation of the Higher Education Free Speech on Campuses Act 2023 with the creation of a specific watchdog for free speech in universities. This creates an incremental and slow deterioration in the UK. But the most spectacular and dramatic change occurred in the US. The US entered in the report in 2020 in the context of COVID-19 crisis and of conservative state policies. In 2025, the US attacks coming from the federal state represented 19.5% of all the attacks worldwide against academic freedom. Yet, academic freedom and liberal democracies are closely connected. The post-World War II growth of modern universities was connected to the spread of liberal and democratic ideologies. As reminded by Tom Ginsberg and Aziz Huq, the practical operation of liberal democracy requires a shared epistemic foundation, where information is systematically distorted by government. Democracy cannot fulfill this epistemic mandate. Just as independent media is based on fact-checked information, modern universities are part of the knowledge institutions described and defended by Vicky Jackson as the necessary guardians of democratic epistemic foundations. They allow government scrutiny and accountability before the people by developing and encouraging critical and independent thinking from the citizens. In this way, they are an essential part of the ecosystem that allows liberal democratic democracies to work. A pattern that was also highlighted by the publication last October of the Stephanie Bonds report, which highlights the importance of academic freedom for French democracy. In every democratic system, the specific epistemic role for universities is protected under academic freedom. When the notion emerged in the 19th century Germany, it entailed both the autonomy of the university as self-governing body and the freedom of teaching and learning. Today, both of these dimensions are at stake, even in what we can call old or consolidated democracies like the US and the UK. In the context of this presentation, I would like to depart from what the late Professor Ron Ilsch would have labeled as the usual suspect, Hungary and Poland, and to adopt a slightly different perspective by questioning how, in so-called consolidated or old democracy, attack upon academic freedom are one of the makers of mechanism and democratic backsliding, and how this discourse against academic freedom can sustain and help to develop illiberal policies and ultimately illiberal government when populists are in power. Building my main argument on the contribution of previous large and comparative studies, I will only focus on the British and the American example, with the UK maybe offering an example of kind of healing practice after a period of illiberal policies and governments, and on the other hand, with the beginning of term 2 term, a government and a system that was marked by systematic, violent, and uncompromising attacks against universities that was already announced by Vice President Vance when he said universities are the enemy. So I will very quickly expose 3 different steps in my reasoning. First, the eroding process of academic freedom in old democracies. For in the second time, and in second step, presents how once populists are in powers, and using the American example, how academic freedom can be harmed, and finally, as a conclusion, how we can try to defend academic freedom. So I've been, here is for my outline. So, about eroding academic freedom. In the context of consolidated democracies, attacks on academic freedom are plural and come from diverse directions. Some are directly coming from the civil society, which I will call bottom-up erosion. Others are coming from government, which I will call top-down erosion. But both are the marker of a refusal of the liberal script of science, that science must question individual assumptions and beliefs with no regard for political agendas. So for bottom-up erosion, according to Professor Ginsberg, all knowledge in an open society is provisional, and it is a practice of a continuous interrogation of settled truths. However, The polarization of society tends to reduce the acceptability of concurring views and the Karl Popper's principle of scientific falsification. This resulted in the development of mechanisms aimed to silence, targeting, and weakening academic freedom. Indeed, no platforming, disinvitation, online harassment, and defamation campaign against professors because of their teachings had been one of the main threats against freedom of research and teach in the UK and US for the past 10 to 15 years. These actions are used by both left and right pressure groups, just as shown the recent British cases of Professor George on March 2026, or Professor Gordon at the University of Bristol, or Professor Ruth Alperian Kederi at the London School of Economics. So that is for the liberal script of science. The main mechanism, platforming, was first used in the 70s when the UK National Union of Students adopted a policy under that name prohibiting students' union from giving representative of the fascist National Front Party access to speaking engagement in the British universities. But its use overgrew the simple context of far-right speaker and is now applied broadly to external speakers invited on campuses, as well as professors themselves in the context of their teaching. Some try to defend a liberal version of no platforming, others are defending the idea that by its nature, no platforming is illiberal. But in any case, no platforming and related actions tend to create a chilling effect and a risk of self-censorship among scholars. More critically, these political actions have fed a broader discourse on the so-called cancel culture and culture war on campuses, and worsened the political polarization in universities. These bottom-up erosions have served as a justification for both US and UK government to implement policies limiting academic freedom through the weaponization of free speech. So just at the beginning of this month, in Tennessee, a law called the Charlie Kirk Act was adopted and intends to prohibit the state's public colleges and universities from disinviting campus speakers. This new legislation is just one among others using free speech as a tool to frame and tame academic freedom. Unlike Hungary or Poland, where national identity and Christian values were the main justification for limiting academic freedom, in the context of the US and UK, illiberal policies turned against each other free speech and academic freedom. This weaponization of free speech can result in both silencing some researchers on specific and sensitive topics, and at the same time offering a renewed platform to views that were no longer accepted in the scientific debate. In the UK, the free speech on campuses movement started in 2019 under the Johnson's government, and after the publication of a report from conservative think tank Policy Exchanges claiming that free speech was no longer protected on British campuses. The main argument was that social justice campaigners on campuses created a threatening climate for students and professors holding minority and, to be understood, conservative views. Cambridge University regulation and Oxford University practices were used as examples for demonstrating how free speech had been limiting in the universities. This resulted in the presentation before the Parliament of a free speech on campuses bill, ultimately adopted in 2023 as the Higher Education Freedom of Speech Act after Labour government amending. This act creates a new free speech complaint system with a specific and independent watchdog called the Office for Students. And in March 2025, the Office for Students fined the University of Sussex for £500,000, mainly over a transgender and non-binary inclusion policy, which the regulator said to have a chilling effect on freedom of speech. This decision was quashed by the High Court at the end of last month. The US example offers a more complex picture for this top-down process erosion because of the relatively weak protection offered to academic freedom. Indeed, academic freedom is protected on two distinct approaches. One is a professional norm defined and protected by the American Association of University Professors, and defined in the 1915 Declaration and the 1940 Statements. Another way to protect and to understand academic freedom is based on the First Amendment and the different cases about individual freedom of academic freedom and institutional academic freedom. The way the government and the state's government used this foundation within the First Amendment is by turning against oneself institutional freedom and individual freedom, and then general freedom of speech, again, academic freedom. The erosion process of academic freedom in liberal democracies under the pressure of illiberal policies or discourse has long-lasting effects. It weakens academic freedom and opens paths to forthcoming future illiberal pressure, especially when populist and illiberal politicians arrived in power. And it is when the American example became the main study case for harming academic freedom. Indeed, it appeared that the US started to follow the Hungarian matrix to capture academia by exerting both institutional and individual pressure over universities. So these schemes are from the Free to Think report made by the Scholar at Risk Association. And it basically shows that main attacks in the United States are of administrative nature and legal pressure. And this is in line with the pattern to capture, I think it's later, to capture academia in illiberal states. So the main pressures are on two different fields, institutional or individual. At the level of institutional pressures, what is targeted is institutional autonomy. And you can see here that since 2019, 2020, the institutional autonomy of US universities started to decrease. It was first because of states' policies and now because of federal policies. So these institutional pressures were articulated around two different steps. The first step was through cuts in federal funds for university. And the two main arguments were about the reject of diversity, equality, and inclusivity policies, and every university that tried to resist the executive order asking for the closing of these DEI programs was threatening of important fund cuts and attack against their institutional autonomy. The second arguments for these cuts were regarding the policing and the question of Israel, Palestine, West Bank protests on campus in the universities. So the conflicts and protests coming from the students were used as a weapon against universities by the Trump administration to justify some cuts in the federal fundings. This led to a chilling effect and new forms of no platforming, as now, since the start of Trump's 2 mandate, the main part of no platforming are not coming from the civil society, but from the universities themselves under the pressure of Trump administration. So the universities started to disinvite speakers, just fire some professors or close some courses and some events because of the risk of cuts fundings coming from the federal government. So one of the lights in all of this is maybe how Harvard University reacts by opposing the Trump administration, and the fact that in a case ruled by the District of Massachusetts courts, federal courts found out that this kind of cuts and the executive order against DEI were against the First Amendment, against free speech, and against academic freedom. However, we're still waiting for an appeal to the Supreme Court, and I have very few hope about this point. Another step, and the second step, occurred in October 2025 when Trump administration issued the Compact for Excellence in Higher Education. Sorry. No, I'm lost. Where is it? Yeah, sure. In the higher education, which is basically a proposal of agreement between universities and Trump administration conditioning federal funds to the respect by universities of discourse and teaching lines determined by the Trump administration. So this compact was largely rejected by universities, but a second compact is now at a discussion within the Trump administration. So the first reaction from the universities was total shock. Few voices were heard at first, especially after Columbia University accepted the conditions imposed by Trump administration, but the Harvard case opened a path for resistance, as well as the AUUP resources offered to scholars. Regarding the individual pressure, and I'm just going to mention them, the main are loss of position, so professors that are fired because of the topics, because of research projects they are heading, but also students that lost their fundings and their support from federal state to pursue their study. The second, and maybe the most critical, was the use of ICE and deportation against students, foreign students with legal status and legally on the American territory, but who protested against Israeli war against Palestine and were specifically targeted because of their expression on campuses. And here you have two main examples, so Mahmoud Khalil and Rusmeya Ozug, who were both of them. Second, Rumeyya was deported, and Mahmoud Khalil is still waiting for his deportation. And there was a new development just last night on this case. So, just to conclude very briefly, how can we think about defending academic freedom in the context of democratic backsliding, even in all democracies? So first answer, and maybe the main obvious, is judicial resistance. But I would say it's maybe not the most optimistic path, I think, because basically if you think about the US context, we know that we are in a context of abusive judicial review, and the SFFA against Harvard decision in 2023 just proved that the Supreme Court is ready to stop affirmative action and to reduce more generally diversity in universities. In the UK, where there was a less dramatic and spectacular conservative turn in the Supreme Court, I'm not very much more optimistic because there is this important judicial restraint from the Supreme Court, and I think they will maybe more in line with the Office for Students than with professors. We noticed some professional guarantees developed in other communal systems under illiberal policies from governments in Australia and Canada, for example, based on unions and labor law resources. But maybe the main aspect of defense is this idea that academic freedom cannot develop in a vacuum and needs to be in an environment that protect and also educate people about the importance of this principle. In this way, the idea of knowledge institution developed by Vicky Jackson is important, as well as scholarly activism as defended by some important scholars in North America. Thank you.
Thank you very much.